Hello everyone, and welcome to today's kitchen session, the Placenta Demystifying the Human Tree of Life. My name is Zazel and I'm a HE advisor here at the University of Chester. And today I'm joined by Dr. Gareth Nye, a lecturer in Chester Medical School here at the university. You'll see him shortly. He'll be delivering the session and I'm being assisted behind the scenes by Gavin. I'll start by reassuring you that your video and audio are not shared at all during the course of this session. And in terms of how today will work, I will shortly be handing over to Gareth. During the presentation, you'll be able to ask questions in the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. You can ask questions anonymously if you wish. You just need to have ticked the box to say that you wish to be anonymous. You can also give a thumbs up to questions that other people have asked and answer any questions that Gareth may ask by responding in the chat function. I'll ask, Gavin will ask Gareth your questions at the end of the session. So I think that's everything. Over to you, Gareth.
Hi, thank you for the introduction and thank you everyone for joining me on what is a really glorious day outside. So hopefully this will make it a little bit worthwhile coming in for 20 minutes or so and give you a flavour of what the Chester Medical School has to offer. So I thought I'd introduce by just quickly saying who I am or what I am more relevantly. I'm the programme lead for medical science at Chester Medical School, which is an undergraduate programme. And I also teach a lot of anatomy, physiology and pathophysiology, which is sort of the diseases, and also some more medical and clinical based stuff. Away from the teaching, I also research in maternal and fetal health. And this broadly includes anything related to pregnancy, early years, so breastfeeding, child development, and any maternal problems that do occur during pregnancy. So considering all of that, we're going to move on to what we're actually going to talk to today. And I've called this sort of mini talk, the Placenta, Demystifying the Human Tree of Life. Now there's a picture of the tree of life there, and hopefully as we go along you'll understand why I've called the placenta the tree of life. I'm not sure I can really demystify it completely, but hopefully at the end you should be able to understand this organ a little bit better. That's me, and this is my amazing family. Okay. There is an undeniable link between a mother and her children. So this is my amazing wife, Joanne here, and our 3 children. Cameron there is 8 months old, so he was born last year during all the COVID stuff. And there is no denying that there is a connection between Joanne and our children and every mother out there. And this connection goes through life and is almost classed as the maternal sixth sense. It's well documented anecdotally and otherwise that mums know about their children inside and out. However, this connection is not just a mental one, it's also a physical one. And it started right from the second that you started to be you. And that connection is the key to all human life, because without it, we wouldn't be here. And this connection, this physical connection, is called the placenta. So what actually is the placenta? So here's a little cartoon here, and you can see the placenta on the left-hand side, the baby on the right-hand side, and the wiggly line in between is the umbilical cord. So the placenta is an organ which is formed from that fertilized egg and grows with the baby during pregnancy. In a healthy full term or at the end of pregnancy, it can weigh quite a lot. So it normally weighs around 650 grams and is roughly the size of a dinner plate. Now, because this is a kitchen session, I went and raided my kitchen. So you know that this is roughly the size of the placenta. However, I've also raided my daughter's play kitchen, and you can see that this is also the size of a placenta in some cases. So even though it's roughly the size of a dinner plate, it can be any size really. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. What it does mean, though, is that the placenta is the only way a growing baby can receive all the necessary nutrients, gases, and other factors that they need to develop correctly. And it also goes the other way. So it also helps with the removal of waste products as well. But how do we get to this point? Well, to begin with, we have to go right back to fertilization. You can see here the first 6 days. Day 1 is when the egg is fertilized, and day 6 is when we start to see a significant change. The first 6 days are obviously a very busy time period for this baby. We go from one fertilized egg into a cell with 3 distinct regions. And it's at this stage where it's called a blastocyst. And this is a structure formed in the early development of most mammals. It possesses what's called an inner cell mass, and this is what eventually forms the embryo itself. The outer layer of the blastocyst contains the cells called the trophoblast, and this is going to be important as we move through. So there you can see that it's quite well defined under the microscope, and you can see these 3 sections quite clearly. At this stage, the blastocyst is still freely floating around the uterus. But in order to grow, it needs that supply of nutrients. And the best source here is the lining of the uterus called the endometrium. However, in some cases, the fertilized egg leaves this uterus space completely. And if it does that, it will attach to anything that has a ready blood supply. This is usually the fallopian tubes, which are the connecting route between the uterus and the ovary. However, it can implant anywhere within the female reproductive system and beyond. With around 1% of cases, the egg implants into the intestinal lining. And this is what's referred to as an ectopic pregnancy. And within the UK, around 1 in 90 pregnancies are classed as ectopic, which is around 11,000 pregnancies a year. But what happens normally is that by day 12, the blastocyst has begun to change and has embedded itself within the uterus. What's crucial is that the layer on the outside, the trophoblast cells, release enzymes that break away the wall of the uterus and allow it to bury itself within it. They also release growth factors, such as human chorionic gonadotrophin, or HCG, which is the marker that pregnancy tests use, as well as insulin-like growth factor to allow this invasion into the uterus lining. Now, this stage is called implantation, and it allows for the remainder of the pregnancy to develop. This includes the formation of the placenta and the formation of the embryo. You can already see by day 12, you've got different areas and different sections, which will ultimately be the embryo, the amniotic sac, and the placenta. Now, these cells need to organize a blood supply. Otherwise, they're not going to get the necessary nutrients needed. So within the endometrium, within that layer of the uterus, there are blood vessels called spiral arteries, and you can see them on the left-hand side there. They're called spiral arteries because they really do look like a spiral. And they're tightly coiled for most of a woman's life to allow some blood to enter the uterus, but are able to open up and expand during pregnancy. If this doesn't occur, there would be either massive blood loss during the menstruation period or not enough blood supply during pregnancy. Blood flow to the uterus alone during the end of pregnancy increases by up to 50%, with blood flow to the uterus itself reaching almost 600 millilitres a minute. That's a lot of blood coming in. And it's important that the trophoblast cells that come off that fertilized egg block the vessels, so you can open them up without causing too much damage to the growing baby in the first few weeks, or triggering the maternal system, who might think of it as a foreign body or a bacteria or something like that and trying to attack. So it's important that this is controlled and allows the right amount of blood in at the right time. So if we skip right through now to the end of pregnancy, then you can see the placenta here. It looks very different. You can still see the spiral arteries there, but you can also see how they've arranged themselves around different structures. Blood leaves the spiral artery into a space called the intervillous space. And the blood is allowed to flow around the fetal vessels. You can see look like kind of mini trees. And this is where exchange occurs between the mum's blood supply and the baby's. So mum's blood comes in via the arteries, circulates around, and then leaves via the veins. And on average, there could be 50 of these fetal tree structures within a placenta arranged around the blood supplies of the mum. Baby's blood comes via the fetal vein into these villus trees and leaves again via the arteries. Both travel through the umbilical cord to and from the baby. And the umbilical cord enters the baby through its belly button, or what would be its belly button when it's born. The crucial thing here is that mum's blood and baby's blood never come into direct contact. This could be massively problematic for both mum and baby if bloods do come into contact. The reason for that is the baby is only half of the mum. So the mum's immune system would treat the baby as a foreign object and would try and get rid of it as it would any other infection. So all of the exchange has to happen in a very secure and organised way. I thought I'd use some real life images of these fetal villus trees to show you how similar they are. So on the left is the schematic diagram, the little cartoon diagram of one, and on the right is a real image. And you can see that these protrusions pop up everywhere, and they tend to be in areas that are high in the nutrients and oxygens that they need. So you can see from this diagram that there are a number of layers between the maternal blood and the baby's blood, and this controls the flow across. These barriers stop the interaction. However, it makes transfer really difficult. Okay, so the placenta needs a number of different ways to ensure that the baby gets everything it needs. And this ranges from simple diffusion, as you can see on the far right there, which usually involves gases like oxygen, through to complex processes called endocytosis, where they sort of engulf and move any products through. So the sort of stuff that does pass through the placenta includes alcohol, anesthetic drugs, antibodies in some cases. Things like glucose, iron and oxygen are all really important. But all of this effort from the placenta to exchange all of these things that are required for the baby to grow takes an awful lot of energy. Energy is produced within cells of the body, but particularly within placental cells via the production of ATP. And in order to produce ATP, you need oxygen. So a review of some of the data that's out there, with the addition of some lab work that I've done, has shown that between 40 and 70% of all the oxygen that comes into the placenta is used by the placenta itself, which means there isn't an awful lot of oxygen left to transfer to the baby. But that's okay, because all of that effort and energy and oxygen goes towards helping the baby grow. What we've also found is that it gets even more stark than that. Up to 60% of the oxygen is lost within 9 millimeters of entering the placental tissue. The majority is lost within 3 millimeters. So the placenta is really oxygen hungry in order to fuel all of these transfer mechanisms that are going on. So it's not only referred to as the tree of life because of its roles in pregnancy and the roles in the production of life. It even looks a little bit like a tree, and it's even called a tree. What's even more amazing is these small vessels from the fetal side can move and grow towards areas that are high in the things that the baby needs. So if it needs more nutrients or oxygen, it will move and grow towards them. And this is very much like a tree or a plant growing towards sunlight. And it's useful in situations where the supply from mum might be damaged, there might be a blockage of a blood vessel somewhere, or a compression of the blood vessel somewhere. So blood can be moved around and the placenta will grow and adapt to it. Even if you take the placenta as a whole, it even then looks a little bit like a tree. So it definitely earns its title of the human tree of life. So some of what we've seen at this stage, the placenta comes from the fertilized egg, attaches to the uterus, and the cells eat away at the uterus to open up blood vessels to allow for exchange to occur. The placenta takes most of the oxygen and nutrients for itself to create enough energy to allow for the exchange to happen. And we've already seen in ectopic pregnancies how things can go wrong. But what about if the placenta goes wrong somehow? So if I go back to this picture from before, and we think about how the blood vessels within the uterus need to be opened up, in some cases, the trophoblasts don't open the blood vessels up enough. And so these spiral arteries remain quite small and are quite resistant to flow coming through them. And this means the blood flow isn't sufficient enough to safely support the pregnancy. And this can lead to problems as the pregnancy continues. And one of these problems is preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is recognised by the maternal development of high blood pressure and organ dysfunction. And it's the most common severe pregnancy complication within America and worldwide, affecting 2 to 8% of all pregnancies, and unfortunately leads to many poor outcomes for the mum. Its clinical presentation can be quite varied and can be quite confusing. Its onset could be gradual or sudden. It can be present during or even after birth. So it's very difficult for them to properly diagnose this condition. And although maternal deaths from preeclampsia are now quite rare, concerns about maternal safety cause the early delivery of the baby. And this can quite often transfer the problem onto the baby themselves. Therefore, despite advances in clinical care, delivery of the baby and the placenta remains the only cure for preeclampsia. But this often has to occur before 34 weeks. Babies born prematurely, often in combination with growth restriction because of a poor blood supply, are at risk of short-term complications as well as lifelong disabilities and have a lifetime increased risk of cardiometabolic disease. So it's quite a dangerous solution to a dangerous condition. But what is this fetal growth restriction? So fetal growth restriction is a condition that is banded around quite a lot, and it's ultimately a catch-all for any condition where the fetus or the baby doesn't reach the growth potential it should based on its genetic profile. And it occurs of a rate between 3 and 8 per 100 worldwide, and over half of neonatal deaths worldwide are associated with this low birth weight. Placentas, because that's what we're talking about, from fetal growth restricted babies are on average a quarter smaller than you would in a normal pregnancy. So something is going on there. And often there are many different causes for a growth restriction in a baby. There could be maternal factors, so anything that the maternal system does to limit the amount of oxygen nutrients. This could be things from smoking, undernutrition, but could also just be living in high altitude. Placental issues may be the cause, such as preeclampsia, but it could also just be poor development. Or fetal issues themselves, like congenital defects. Having twins or triplets will also limit the size of each of them as well. So whilst with the research group in Manchester, what we wanted to do is look at how oxygen moves through the placenta in normal and growth restricted babies. And what we did was quite cool. We took placentas from women who had just given birth and brought them into the lab and almost kept them alive like you would during an organ transplant. So a lot of tubing and a lot of fluids to keep them alive. And from here we used really state-of-the-art probes to measure oxygen around the placenta to see how it works. And what this allowed us to do was to create these heat maps that you can see here, which look very much like weather maps. But basically all you need to know is that oxygen that's high is a red or an orange colour, and oxygen that's low is a blue or a purple colour. And in a normal pregnancy, oxygen gets lower and lower as you go deeper into the placenta, but this doesn't happen with growth restriction. So we wanted to know why, and we looked at the vessels underneath. And what we found was there are less vessels in the fetal growth restricted placentas than there are in the normal ones. However, it's kind of chicken and egg, because we don't know whether the vessels are lower to begin with or whether they're lower because there is a lack of oxygen. And all of this we still don't understand. So why do we struggle to understand the placenta? Why do we struggle to demystify it? Well, it's really, really hard to study the placenta, particularly in humans. We can't trust animal models like you would in some other conditions because each animal's placenta is different. We can't study the placenta during pregnancy because there are too many risks and ethical issues. And if anyone has watched the program on Channel 4, Baby Surgeons, you should understand how tricky it is to interact with a pregnancy. We can't use imaging techniques like MRI because it's too difficult to separate the mum's and the baby's blood. And unless you have specialised equipment to keep it alive, which I was lucky to use, but you're only getting around 10 sites around the world, the placenta functions disappear almost immediately after birth. So there are so many different factors in both baby, mum and the placenta that can influence and change that we have absolutely no idea what's really going on. So what? So why does it make a difference? Why do we need to understand the placenta? Without understanding the placenta, we struggle to know a few basic facts which would advance our understanding of pregnancy so far. If we don't know how it works normally, we can't even begin to understand how it works in diseases like preeclampsia. So this limits our ability to design drugs, treatment options that will work effectively. We also don't know how drugs and compounds cross the placenta between mum and baby. And this limits options for mums during pregnancy who rely on long-term medications, and it can lead to some difficult conversations around pregnancy and the use of drugs. And what happens to babies during pregnancy can have a lifelong impact for them. We've seen that in fetal growth restriction. It can lead to a number of lifelong problems such as cardiovascular disease, as well as increased risk of type 2 diabetes. There's also an idea that there is a developmental origin to health and disease that all starts from that early pregnancy period. And if we understand this, we may be able to get rid of diseases in later life right from the very beginning. In fact, a lot of our lives have been influenced by our grandparents. So as you can see there, as women are born with all the eggs they'll ever have, the egg that formed you was within your mum whilst they were a baby inside your grandma. And this has been evidenced by women who were pregnant during the war rationing periods and other situations like that. So we may find a new generation of problems because of the influence of COVID and lockdowns and everything else. But we wouldn't know that for decades to come. And the research at the minute is really mixed. We don't know what is going on within pregnancies and COVID. Some are saying it's fine, some are saying it's not fine. And this all comes back to the fact that we don't really understand the placenta very well. What's promising is that there's no evidence that the vaccine can impact a pregnancy, which is really pleasing to see. However, recent reports have seen that there are some changes within the maternal reproductive system because of this vaccine. And we don't know how this is going to impact women's ability to have babies, if at all. Additionally, we have to think after birth as well. Little is considered about the effects pregnancy has on women after birth, but the numbers there are quite stark. This could be down to the impact of the placenta during the pregnancy and a lack of our understanding of this connection. But we have to think of pregnancy as not just the 9 months, but lifelong.
Thanks for that, Gareth. Some really interesting stuff there. Just got a few questions for you. When you mentioned the research you were doing, you mentioned some quite specific equipment that you got to use that's quite rare. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that equipment was and how it worked.
Yeah, so we basically had to replicate the mum's body outside of the mum, which is quite a challenge. We had to get fluid that matches blood but wasn't the same as blood. And we had to pump that at the same rate as the mum's heart would be pumping and at the same blood pressure and everything like that. It had to be all temperature controlled and everything. So it's really specific stuff. But what that allowed us to do was to almost replicate what it would be like in pregnancy without opening up a mum as it was. And then to measure oxygen, we got these really special needle probes, and we were the first to use them, that used light and how light reacted to oxygen in order to measure how the oxygen moved between the tissue itself. So it was really quite cool and something that we couldn't do anywhere else in the world.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, from listening to your presentation, while it's clear that we've made big advances when it comes to complications and that sort of thing, from what you're talking about, it's clear that there's still a lot of mystery around the placenta, a lot that we still don't know, and a lot of challenges when it comes to analysing it. Are there any technological advances or any research you know of, or things you're looking into yourself, maybe your own research that that points to the future and even learning more about the placenta?
Like I sort of said, that it's so difficult to get any real research in human pregnancy just because it's so complicated. A lot of what we're doing has to be happening after birth, and there's a lot going on in terms of looking at blood vessels and how the mum's blood system reacts. What we've been beginning to look at is how the risk to the mum of heart attacks and things like that increases after birth. So that's something that is current and ongoing. But from my own personal point of view, recently looking at how the COVID pandemic has influenced maternity services and a mum's opinion and idea of how their pregnancy went. There's going to be a lot of problems because of COVID relating to pregnancy.
Brilliant, thanks. And I think lastly, you quite often hear of people eating placenta or using it as a face cream and those sort of things. I was wondering if there is any scientific merit in those sort of things.
It would be very much like getting a big liver that you get from the butchers and blending it up and then rubbing it all over your face. If you wouldn't do that, it's the same sort of thing. There isn't any real scientific evidence to say that ingesting placenta or using it as a face cream or anything like that has any real benefits, apart from that nutrient boost that you'd get, like I said, as if you were to blend up a liver or any other organ. So it's fine if that's what you want to do, but don't expect miracles to happen because of it.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. I think that's all the questions that we've got for today. So thanks again for your time and that presentation, some really interesting stuff. And I'll just hand back to Zazel to close today's session.
Thank you.
That rounds things up for today's session. If you're interested in any other of the kitchen sessions, then please do check the schedule to see when the next ones are coming up. But thank you very much, Gareth. That was very interesting.